introduce today Monika Wohlrab-Sahr, who is a professor in cultural sociology in the University of Leipzig. She's one of the main scholars in sociology of religion nowadays, and she's leading one of the biggest projects in sociology of religion, which is the project on multiple secularities. She's also currently the founder and the co-director of the research group on multiple secularities in the University of Leipzig. When we were deciding to whom to invite in this first seminar series on theory and religion in contemporary world, it was kind of clear from the beginning that Monika was Professor Wohlrab-Sahr was someone that had to be there, no, and has to be part of this seminar series. So I'm really pleased that she accepted. Also at the beginning, we offered her to come to Barcelona, which was difficult in these Corona times. So I'm sorry that this has become an online conference, but I'm really happy that today Monika Wohlrab-Sahr is able to join us. So I'm not gonna keep more time for the introduction. Just I give you the floor, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I would have rather been in Barcelona, you can be sure, but it's better this way than not at all. In this talk, I will deal with a term and with a related debate that has become almost taken for granted over the last 20 years, the term post-secularity. It has become almost natural to say that we live in a post-secular society or have entered a post-secular age. Tons of literature have been published dealing with post-secularism. Journals use the term in their self-description or publish special volumes about it. As someone doing research under the agenda of multiple secularities, as you have just heard, this caused me a certain unease and provoked me to deal with this debate more closely beyond the initial aversion that there might be something wrong with the term. Then I realized that various scholars have already undertaken attempts at ordering the debate, among them James Beckford, Mollendijk, McLennans, Schevel, Forani, and others more. Their papers are all very helpful and certainly present a broader picture than I will present here. They are all worth reading, by the way, but I will not repeat them here. What I will do is to distinguish between two different programmatic approaches as I see them in the debate, a softer and a stronger version, as it seems to me, with regard to their basic assumptions, and then I will relate them to what we in Leipzig have called multiple secularities in our research group. But let me start with the beginning of the more recent debate since Habermas' reintroduction, one needs to say, of an older term. So I start with the prominence of the post-secular diagnoses. Social diagnoses of the notion of the post-secular have become popular, especially since Jürgen Habermas' famous lecture after the attacks of 9/11, 2001. When being awarded the Peace Prize of the Booksellers Association, Habermas related the term post-secular society to a new consciousness in Western societies, which up to then considered themselves secular. He did not speak of the end of secularity or secularization and did not mean that either. But he spoke about a new awareness that in these societies, the self-perception of being secular might not hold true for everybody, a new awareness of the presence of religion in these societies. He thereby referred to the example of migrants' religiosity in comparison to the broad religious indifference often prevalent among the majority population, as well as to the Islamist attacks of 9/11, which had violently brought religion back on the table. And in the line of his previous works on communication, he extended his argument to the need of acknowledging religious voices and argumentation in the public sphere. Out of this impulse emerged a strand of research which more or less follows the line of thought that Habermas has sketched. These works, I would say, were more or less about the simultaneity of secularization and the newly visible presence of religion. The notion of the post-secular society that he brought in addresses a change in the awareness of religious presence, as well as a change of the religious presence as such, while secularization in different regards still remained a valid diagnosis. Secularization as a diagnosis referring to the diminishing importance of religion for the majority populations of many Western, especially Western European societies, as well as to the functional differentiation between religion and other societal spheres. This perspective, I think, is easily reconcilable with research in the social sciences. It highlights tensions and contradictions, which are sometimes conflictive in nature, sometimes irritating in a productive way. Examples refer to interactions, aesthetics, urban spaces, and others more. The term post-secular society indicates changes and frictions, but not necessarily a fundamental crisis. I call this approach ideal-typically the awareness of simultaneity approach. This is rather unproblematic to reconcile with the multiple secularities approach, even if it is certainly not identical with it. Usually the term used in this context is post-secular society. Within this approach, there is one variant, which as far as I see, is represented by one author mainly, the Protestant theologian Ingolf Dalfert. For him, post-secularity represents a societal or political constellation in which the religious-secular divide has simply become irrelevant. If one relates this to Habermas' approach, however, one must ask if it is not exactly the irritation of this indifference that he thinks we are facing. Now I come to what I thought to have identified as a second approach, namely the crisis of secular modernity approach. Since the time of Habermas' lecture, the talk about the post-secular has literally exploded and has found many places, references, and allies. It has been linked with the ongoing critique of secularism, of secularization theory, and of the secular religious divide. It has aligned with postmodern positions and post-colonial approaches, and with the so-called critical religion or critical secularity approaches in religious studies. Thereby, a new strand of theoretical perspective has emerged that I would say differs significantly from the first approach. It implies much stronger presuppositions and a much stronger version of our notion of critique. I would assemble these contributions under the label crisis of secular modernity approach. They do not establish a consistent theory. They are not one single approach, which makes them difficult to discuss. But they are similar, I would say, with regard to certain basic features. The supporters of this second strand of theory mostly come from philosophy and theology, from anthropology or cultural studies, some also from international relations. But through forms of interdisciplinary exchange, they are also entering into sociology. For this second group, I would say the term post-secularism has become influential as a catchword to express one's reservation and critical attitude towards something which is considered problematic and even violent. Thereby, this approach has also produced projections of victimhood on the side of the minority for which often Islam has come to stand. When I say this, I'm not questioning the existence of power imbalances and discrimination between majorities and minorities, nor the existence of stereotypical accounts of Islam as opposed to the West. However, my impression is that Islam has received importance as a topos in that debate in a way that makes it difficult to discuss problems, contradictions, and tensions related to it, other than those arising from the domination through the majority population. Nevertheless, it is interesting to look at this trend of the debate from a sociological perspective. Benjamin Schevel, a philosopher from Duke University, has hinted to the fact that the term post-secular has a much longer history than Habermas's lecture. A history that reaches back into the 1950s and, as he argues, was at that time linked to the crisis of man debate and the axial age discourse, which emerged at the same time. Taking this seriously, the post-secularity debate has a history of about 70 years, combining several perspectives which culminate in a diagnosis of crisis, transition, and the idea of a newly emerging order, or one that is considered necessary to emerge. This is, in its very fundaments, a normative debate rather than one that refers to empirical data. And if it does so, they mainly serve as a proof for their main argument. This strand of the debate includes very general statements on Western modernity and its relation to secularity, the nation state, as well as religious minorities, especially Islam. One gets the impression that secularism becomes a term to address all possible evils and illnesses of Western modernity. Post-secularism then stresses domination, difference, sometimes even incomparability, because the use of concepts developed in the West are considered to reproduce domination when comparing diverse things with the same concepts. This makes it, on the one side, interesting as many other diagnoses of the contemporary situation, but on the other side, it makes it difficult to argue pro or con, because the debate often lacks concrete empirical proofs that could serve as a common reference in a debate. Therefore, my attempt to discuss some lines of the debate and what I consider its implications will probably not be convincing to many of those who gather under the umbrella of the post-secular, but maybe it will nevertheless help to open a debate. I identify the following main threads in the diverse contributions on post-secularity of this second approach. First, a critical view of secularism and secularization theory, as well as of the use of the secular religious binary. This sometimes extends to a critique of the use of differentiation perspectives as such. Second, a critical perspective on Western secular modernity, which is considered to be violent against non-Western religion in the colonial encounter, as well as towards minority religions at present, especially Islam. And one needs to add, which is considered to be in a deep crisis itself. Third, a positive evaluation of religion, especially, but not only, of minority religion, especially Islam, which is at the same time considered the main victim of secular modernity. And fourth, a positive assessment of the need to acknowledge or even give more space to religion in public. I consider these the basic lines of the second, stronger version of post-secularity. The positive evaluation of religion, by the way, may refer to Christianity as the dominant religious tradition, as in the case of radical orthodoxy, represented by John Milbank and others. It may, in a more abstract way, refer to attempts of re-enchantment of the world in general or of the public sphere, as William Barbieri has put it, who has spoken of these attempts as a promising project. They may thereby relate to notions of political theology, bringing Carl Schmitt back on the agenda, by linking the crisis of Western modernity to its decline of transcendence, as has been argued by Cerella. Or they may refer to Islamic and even Islamist practices as the epitome of resistance against Western modernity, as has been highlighted by Marvella and Pasha. These practices, as Amir Mufti has put it, I quote, are understood explicitly or implicitly as an expression of religious consciousness directed against the inroads of secularism, which itself is viewed simply as an ideological impulse of the ongoing projects of Western imperialism, end of quote. Recently, this has been aligned with a general critique of the secular religious binary, as it was inspired by Talal Asad and the scholars in his footsteps, labeling themselves as critical religion. They see the political and the academic use of the religious secular binary as an expression of epistemic violence, brought into the world with colonialism and the nation state, and considered alien to the regions and populations to which it was brought and on which, in politics as in research, it has been projected. The terminology used here is not post-secular society, but rather post-secularism or post-secular age, both insinuating a fundamental change or a change necessary to come. They address in their own words a transitional stage towards something new. It does not become clear, it did not become clear to me at least, if this new stage pushes secularity aside and what this actually would mean. The reintroduction of religion into politics, law, and science, or something else. My impression is that these debates rest on the very foundation of secular societies, constitutions, and open public spheres, whose legitimacy they nevertheless put into question and upon whose enabling conditions they hardly reflect. I come to my second point, much shorter point, which I have labeled Islam as a topos. It is not easy to discuss the substance of this debate because it is hardly empirically grounded, but mostly, I think, a normative diagnosis of the modern Western society and a critical statement about the society and its implications for minorities. It has, however, I would say, severe implications for empirical research and for the interpretation of empirical findings. And I want to illustrate this by using the example of the conflicts about the burqa, which I think in Europe, which I think leads to different interpretations in the two approaches that I have distinguished. In line with the first approach, the prohibition of the wearing of the burqa in France or Belgium, as opposed to different regulations in Catalonia, which Margiera, Marian Burchardt, and others have dealt with, could be interpreted as an expression of a post-secular society in Habermas' sense of the term, in which strong tendencies of secularization in the mainstream society clash with the use of the burqa as a very specific type of religious dress, not very common among the Muslim populations in Europe. Its use is partly highly individualized because it is often chosen by converts, whereas elsewhere it is forced upon women by strong societal and religious pressure. So you have, in this case, the presence of secularization and secularist norms in the mainstream society on the one hand, and a religious practice that irritates these norms on the other hand. And you have NGOs like Amnesty International defending the right to wear the burqa as an expression of human rights, and litigations about it in front of the European Court of Human Rights. In this perspective, you would see conflicting norms and practices, different actors with different agendas, making use of institutions and organizations, but all of them possessing agency. The post-secular society then is one in which these interests are simultaneously present and collide with each other. From a stronger version of post-secularity or post-secularism, you might see the burqa, as Judith Butler has put it, as an expression of critique, of heterodoxy and protest. And you might see the burqa ban as a topos, a symptomatic expression of how Muslims are being treated in societies that consider themselves secular. The burqa ban is then in line with all the other forms of discrimination and stigmatization, and the wearing of the burqa becomes an act of resistance against the unifying norms of a secular society. This notion of resistance, which in Butler's case does not refer to an underlying concept of identity, may in other cases very well be related to a strong notion of identity and habitus that cannot be separated from its material religious expression. The secular state and secular versions of critique are then violating Muslims in their inner way of being. This is a position held by Sabah Mahmoud, for example, not with regard to the burqa, but with regard to certain types of critique of the Prophet. You will not be surprised to hear that I find the first version more convincing. It can also easily be aligned with the multiple secularities approach. One might then highlight, as Mark Jere and Marian Burchardt have done, that European countries have responded in different ways to the provocation that the burqa in the public sphere implied. There is not one secularism, but different ways of meaning making with regard to the secular religious distinction and relation. And in that sense, there are different secularities. And I would add, as in most cases, there are agents involved on different sides, playing their trump cards, building alliances, making use of legal institutions and civil society organizations, as well as of strong rhetoric. It is rarely a conflict simply between perpetrators and victims. I would also add to this complication that the outcomes of religious secular relations may even be different in one and the same country like France, when different religious issues and contexts are concerned. The French public and politics may react hyper-allergically to the burqa in public, but France can, compared to other states, nevertheless more easily include Muslim chaplains in its military organization. Where the state can control the inclusion of religion, it can be tolerant also under a strong notion of laicity. But things may be very different when contested religious symbols in the public sphere are concerned. So I would conclude that things are more complicated than strong notions of secularism as an episteme may insinuate. Let me now turn to the concept of multiple secularities. The concept of multiple secularities is in many respects critical towards this strong notion of secularism and post-secularism. And we actually do many things that the post-secularism or critical religion people certainly find problematic. It starts with the use of the term secularity and with the implication that there are various secularities instead of one strong episteme of secularism. What do we mean with multiple secularities? We address this with this term different forms of distinguishing and differentiating religious and non-religious spheres and practices. Distinction refers to the semantic and symbolic level of concepts, whereas differentiation refers to the structural level of institutions. In a programmatic article in 2012, Marian Burchardt and I have argued that the ways of distinguishing and differentiating between religion and its others, like politics, science, education, culture, private life, etc., have cultural underpinnings that express and capture what secularity is about in a specific context. With regard to the national level at that time, we have spoken of different guiding ideas that express the cultural values undergirding the differentiation between religious and non-religious spheres and practices. We have ideal-typically distinguished between 4 such guiding ideas and the specific problems to which they refer. The guiding idea of balancing diversity, which you prominently find in India, the guiding idea of individual liberties, the guiding idea of national integration and progress, and finally, the guiding idea of the autonomy of different societal spheres. This is, I repeat, an ideal typical way of depicting differences and development, and certainly not the last word to be said. All of these notions of secularity also exist next to one another to a certain degree and partially conflict with each other. But usually one of them becomes more influential than others. All of these notions have a history, even if not a continuous one. A history, however, that allows the proponents in the present to relate back to earlier motifs and include them in a genealogy. Tolerance or liberty, for example, are examples of such terms with a long history in the Netherlands. The notion of laïcité as something that is supposed to integrate France as a republic is another example. They are parts of a cultural stock of knowledge that resonates with present forms of secularity and thereby becomes part of a cultural path. This was the beginning of our work on multiple secularities. In the meantime, as you have mentioned, Mar, in the beginning, a large interdisciplinary research group has emerged from these beginnings, which is called Multiple Secularities Beyond the West, Beyond Modernities. The approach of this group in several ways differs from mainstream research on secularization and secularism, even if it takes up some of the questions that are being asked in these types of research. Let me sketch this difference very briefly. First, we are not predominantly interested in secularization, especially not in religious decline. We are mainly interested in one of the other aspects of secularization that David Martin, Jose Casanova, and others have highlighted, namely the differentiation between religion and other spheres of activity. It is this aspect that the Assad school has rendered problematic because they argue that this perspective of differentiation is something that arose in the West under the influence of Christianity and was imposed on others in the colonial encounter, and that this imposition is now being repeated by scholars who are using the secular religious binary. However, when we use the concept of secularity as a heuristic device to look for related phenomena in pre-modern eras and in non-Western regions, this is not in order to presuppose that we will find the same everywhere, but in order to have a tertium comparationis for looking for similarities and differences. The opposite to secularity in that sense of distinctions and differentiations is not religion. It would rather be the concept of an undivided whole that does not allow for differentiation. Such conceptualizations exist. In this sense, we are in direct opposition to approaches that question the legitimacy of differentiation, of a differentiation theory approach as such. This does not mean, however, that we deny phenomena in which the sacred and the profane are closely intertwined, as Yadgar and Haddad have recently argued for religious Zionism. But I would not interpret this from the post-secular angle as the authors do. When we address religion in its relation to other societal spheres on a global scale and aim at global comparisons and include a historical perspective, this certainly clashes with a widespread critique of secularism among scholars who often label themselves post-colonialists. For sure, as post-colonial theorists have rightly argued, power relations have to be taken serious in relation to religious secular distinctions and differentiations. However, there is also a danger of reserving such differentiations for Western contexts and religions, and thereby insinuating that non-Western contexts were completely void of such differentiations. This would turn non-Western contexts into a definite other, and I would say it implies an ultimately identity-based concept of cultures, inasmuch as it insinuates that for some cultures, secularity or secularism must necessarily remain alien. Different from post-secular approaches of the second type, our focus is on the emergence, timing, practice, and effect of secular religious constellations, divides, contestations, and negotiations as they are of relevance to us today. From there, we refer to distinctions and differentiations in the past and in non-Western contexts. This is certainly not without problems. In pre-modern eras, especially in non-Western contexts, the label secular was usually not used, and the phenomena under review should not anachronistically be labeled with a terminology of the presence. But this is not the end of the story either. Pre-modern constellations may have established their own semantic distinctions between different spheres, responsibilities, practices, and sometimes loyalties that are later related to secular religious distinctions, and that can be used to legitimize or to question present endeavors. Early distinctions may have distinguished between powers, loyalties, or simply between forms of expertise. Early forms of differentiation may have created spaces of non-intervention and zones of neutrality, adiaphora as it has been put in the Christian history, in which political power or religious power must not intervene. Conceptualizations of religious freedom, for example, even if they are not directly linked to the idea of a secular sphere, nevertheless establish such a zone of non-intervention. They demarcate the limits of the state or the political unity, as well as of the dominant religion, and thereby pave the way for spaces that may later on be conceptualized as secular. Therefore, what the Leipzig project suggests, in line with several others, of course, is not an ahistorical anachronistic equation between past distinctions and differentiations and present secularities. It is, however, an attempt to establish a comparative perspective that allows for identifying similarities as well as differences, paths and genealogies, options taken and dismissed with regard to different world regions in different eras. To use secularity as a concept does not mean that secular religious oppositions and contestations are of relevance all of the time and under all circumstances. However, we find them as lines of conflict, contestation, and negotiation that pop up under certain conditions and in certain situations from early on, that find different names, are promoted and contested by certain actors, are shaped under different and sometimes contradictory ideological guidelines, and are institutionalized in various forms. Furthermore, to focus on secularity in terms of distinctions and differentiations does not mean that these spheres are perceived as unrelated to each other, as neatly separated boxes. It also does not presuppose a process of differentiation that proceeds automatically, but one that is driven by agents. It does not presuppose a process that proceeds harmoniously, but one that is accompanied by struggles for power. And finally, it does not presuppose a unilinear process, but one that goes back and forth. And it does not presuppose a process that develops in an isolated way, but one that is driven by constant comparisons, competitions, and mutual influences, also in the West, beyond the West. For sure, this historical turn and the turn to non-Western contexts, and indeed already the use of analytical categories such as religion, the secular, or heuristic terms such as secularity, raise a number of serious problems. These criticisms have to be taken seriously, but must not lead, I would say, to principled incommensurability. Arguably, it would be equally problematic and possibly even just as Eurocentric to describe non-Western societies sweepingly as undifferentiated. Social differentiation thus appears rather as a universal structural feature. It may only look different in different cultural contexts. Without naively applying the secular religious binary to pre-modern contexts, we hence ask for distinctions and differentiations relevant to what we today call religion. For the context of their emergence and the actors involved in the formation of both epistemic and social structures, and for the relations and interactions between the two. For a comparison on the level of conceptual distinctions, we therefore have to look for analogous terms in the respective linguistic systems that offered themselves as conceptual resources in the process of appropriating Western categories in the modern era, instead of presupposing the existence of religious and secular domains as such in pre-modern non-Western societies. Historical analyses from both the Latin Christian and the Islamicate world, just to take two examples, show how such distinctions emerge in specific forms from the religious realm, typically in juxtaposition to politics or science, and how they are contested and negotiated. The motivation behind the drive to differentiate religion from politics in pre-modern times may not have been the autonomy of the political sphere, but the interest in safeguarding religion from the corrosive influence of political power. Opposed to present interpretations of the dominance of the secular episteme, it is religion that is often regarded as the domain that was the first to differentiate itself from its social environment by drawing boundaries to other forms of practice, timing, spaces, and expertise. This requires increased attention to the concrete historical constellations under which differentiation takes place. Taking all this into account, the question remains open as to how differentiation theory relates to the issue of secularity, to the distinction and differentiation not only between religion and politics or religion and science, but between religion and a broader secular sphere. The latter rests on certain additional conditions. It needs a specific interpretation to perceive such divisions of labor in terms of secularity, and to assign everything that does not belong to religion to a secular realm. We hence find a differentiation of spheres much more often than religious secular divides, while in some cases de facto differentiations may go along with the establishment of adiaphora, of middle things, or zones of neutrality, or even we may find an explicit denial of such a divide. Such denial may be nurtured by cultural encounters and not least colonial experiences, in which cultural divisions and symbolic orders collide, thus turning implicit assumptions into contested, competing positionings to the world. The emergence of a religious secular binary, in addition to the differentiation of certain functions, can therefore be considered neither natural nor ubiquitous, but rather asks for explanations itself. It adds something to the differentiation of spheres. We may find from early on de facto differentiations the formation of realms that are independent from religion, or to which religion is simply indifferent, but which can hardly be considered secular, for example, superstition or non-organized spirituality. In order to properly understand modes of secularity, hence the concept of differentiation as such is not sufficient. A certain meaning has to be attached to it. This is why Marian Burchert and I have spoken of a cultural sociology of secular modernities, asking for the meanings that underlie secular religious boundaries as specific forms of differentiation patterns. This perspective leads us to the narratives and ideologies that are connected to processes of differentiation and to competing epistemes involved in the drawing of secular religious boundaries. As a first step, binary oppositions related to the differentiation of social domains that modern observers habitually categorize as religion and politics in particular can be observed in a variety of contexts in pre-modern Asia and the Islamicate world. Related narratives can be found that legitimize their relative autonomy and a division of labor, be it for the common good, be it for the decency of each domain, be it for the sake of their own aesthetics, as for example in the field of art. However, when and under which conditions do these semantics turn into secular narratives? The question of actors and their interests, as well as of social structures and networks, are of specific importance in this regard. At the same time, socio-disease, as Bourdieu and later on Philip Gorski have put it, and mythologies are involved in turning differentiated spheres into religious and secular spheres and maintaining them as such. They can be forms of legitimization or delegitimization. However, they can also be interpretations of change, narrations of gain and loss, of disbalancing and upheaval. Narratives and ideologies can be related to the society as a whole or to the individual. Situations of plurality may create their own need of coping with and allowing for coexistence, of creating zones of indifference that may translate into secular spheres of their own kind, with less polarization involved. Also, for the emerging socio-disease and mythologies, it makes a difference whether hierarchy is the dominant issue to deal with or coexistence. Let me conclude. We do not find the same distinctions and differentiations everywhere and at any times. However, we do find distinctions and differentiations related to what we today call religion in many places at many times. If this is turned into a secular sphere under which conditions and when is an empirical question, but it is a possibility, and this possibility is sometimes taken and sometimes rejected. And it is often embattled and fought for or against. It is not something that can be and should be erased from the historical arena of options in the non-Western world under the banner of post-secularism or critical religion, or whatever the writing on the banner may be. Thank you very much.